They're still trying to solve the problems of, the time of Marx and Ricardo.
Right.
Those aren't our problems anymore.
You were in Syria this year, is that right?
Yeah.
What did you learn from Syria?
I was only there briefly, a little over a week, but I was part of a delegation that was visiting Rojava. Rojava is the 3 cantons, autonomous cantons, controlled by the PYD, which is a Kurdish party. It's part of the broad Kurdish movement. It's affiliated with the PKK in a broad way ideologically, not organizationally. And they are engaged in a revolutionary experiment of direct democracy. It's an interesting story. Most people don't know.
What's your specialty?
One of the things I'm interested in, one of the reasons I was there, they basically wanted to bring in a bunch of academics to observe what they were doing. And what's fascinating to me is that nobody knows quite what to say about this. First of all, the PKK are on the terrorist list, because Turkey was fighting a war with them for some time. If you're a non-state actor engaged in a war, then you're automatically a terrorist. They managed to get them on the terrorist list, and it's impossible once you're on the terrorist list to get off. Basically, Turkey would have to say, yes, they can, which they're never going to do. Now, of course, in the process, PKK used to be, like you're finding a fairly standard issue Marxist-Leninist guerrilla force. But they went through this process of self-examination, and they decided, we need to radically transform what we're about. Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, is actually in prison now. Turks nabbed him after this crazy chase around the world. I think they ended up getting him somewhere in Africa. And he's on this little island prison that they built just for him in the Sea of Marmara. But he's had a lot of time to read, and he's kind of got into anarchist theory. He discovered Murray Bookchin, who was a theorist of democratic confederalism, the idea of taking directly democratic organizations and sort of having them confederate at larger and larger levels so that you can have a bottom-up democratic system. And he became fascinated in this sort of stuff. He also became really interested in feminism, and that was something that was already happening in the Kurdish movement at the time. In traditional Kurdish society, it's quite patriarchal. It's a Middle Eastern society. It's always had a little bit more space for women than a lot of their neighbors. There's a certain tradition of women even as fighters, but that exists even in Arab countries.
And what did you see that they were doing right or wrong? Did you give them thoughts about?
Oh, well, it was amazing because I'd never been in a real classic old-fashioned revolution. What happened was this had been under Syrian control, and they managed to convince the Syrian government essentially to leave. They decided the place wasn't worth holding in a situation of civil war. They were going to have an uprising. They basically said, look, if you leave your guns and get out of here, we'll give you safe passage. And the Syrian forces, except for one little airport that they still control, and a piece of one city, Kamislo, they just said, okay, we're out of here. So suddenly, and they took everything. They took even the computers, the wall decorations, everything from the government building is stripped out and left. But then they said, okay, we'll start from scratch and we'll create a democratic society. And there are all these people who've been thinking for 20 years, how would we actually organize a society democratically? Suddenly had about 2 million people who said, well, let's try. And so every neighborhood, every 100 houses, they have a democratic assembly. And every assembly has to have at least 40% women participating, but it has an all-women's group that can veto any decisions. And it has these different working groups, which also work that way, and they confederate on a neighborhood level and then a municipal level. So decisions are made collectively. So they have a government, or something that looks like a government, but essentially they have to. It has a parliament, it has ministers and so forth and so on. That's essentially for dealing with outsiders. In revolutionary parlance, we call this a dual power situation, where you have two different organizations or structures which are both kind of making claims to be the government at the same time, and a balance of power between them. But this is the only time I've ever seen where you have essentially a dual power situation where the same guys created both sides. They knew they had to have something that looks like a government to deal with foreigners, because somebody's got to sign the treaty, somebody's got to, even if you're going to get aid from the UN to help refugees, you need to have somebody official to talk to. So they created something that looks like that. But at the same time, anybody with a gun is not answerable to them. The people with the guns are answerable to the democratic assemblies. And they have these plans to essentially completely decentralize all forms of power. They've only gotten so far because they're being attacked by ISIS. They're in a war. There's only so much they can do. But I went to academy, one of the first places I went to actually, well, the Asaij security forces, kind of like the police. Now, under the Syrian government, Asaij were the scariest people in the world. You know, they were like the guys who arrest you and torture you and for being a dissident. And most of these people had been tortured by the security forces at one point or another who were organizing things.
Was it scary being there?
No, not when I was there, because I mean everybody was your friend, you know. I mean it was great. We had this like driver who drove us around, and the first day they gave us some guys with AK-47s, so you know, like be in the truck in front of us, go riding shotgun just to make us feel secure. But before, you know, we realized no, it was fine. I mean, there's roadblocks everywhere, but the people at the roadblocks were really nice. I mean, and it was so funny to see this taxi driver as he walked by. Every time he'd pass a roadblock, which is like every 10 minutes, you know, it'd be Rojava, Asaij, you know, good afternoon, security forces. And like the last thing you'd ever say in Syria, you know, especially as he was saying in Kurdish, which is a language you're forbidden to talk in Syria. Yeah, and everybody's your buddy, unless they were Arabs, in which case he would say "I love you" in Arabic.
Your father fought in the Spanish Civil War, didn't he?
Yeah, he did.
Does part of you ever have that longing desire to go over there and really get your hands dirty in one of these situations?
Yeah, I'm a little old now. I mean, you know, sure, there's that romantic desire to be on the barricades. I mean, I've been on barricades, but not where they're actually shooting. Or like we're not shooting anyway. The other guys might be. But yeah, it would be nice to shoot back for once. I guess that is a fantasy. Yeah. No. Okay.